Hello, all, and welcome to another History with R&R presents Loki and Vikings. Because you can't have Vikings without Loki. Just saying. Just saying. It's just kind of one of those things. Sorry we've taken so long. It's mostly my fault because my body went south for a while. But we're back, and we're talking people that like to bash people's skulls in.
We're back. You're mad. I'm bad. He's black. I'm pissed. Yeah. Oh, wait. Oops.
Yeah. Wait.
Oops.
You know. Considering these days you can be nailed for blackface for putting up a meme. Let's not call me black.
You mean crucified, nailed up, and yeah,
Yeah.
in public
All right.
square.
So before we get canceled in the first 2 minutes, Loki, what are we gonna yap about today?
Okay, so we've been talking about a lot of battles. We've gone over all kinds of stuff so far. Let's talk about some myths. And the biggest myth, of course, what would you think? What would you think? Hold on. Before we get started, what would you think is the biggest myth about the number one myth, the one everyone always asks about?
Well, I know the horns is one.
That's the number one. So let's get that out of the way right away. Did Vikings wear horns on their helmets? So back in the 20s, an archaeological team discovered a helmet with horns on it. And
Mhm.
they thought, "Oh, this must be a Viking helmet." No, these are from the bronze. There's two of them. They're both from the Bronze Age. Now they do have some long, like curvy horns, almost look like Loki's helmet in the Marvel movie.
Okay.
This is not a Viking helmet. These are from the Bronze Age, and this was 2,000 years before the Vikings even existed. Both of them carbon dated, so that's a myth. The big thing was Wagner, right? So you've got Ride of the Valkyries and the Norse sagas and
Mhm.
Richard Wagner. That is where this whole idea of these horned helmets originated, was in the 19th century, and it was Wagner's compositions that gave them this. Oh, they've got helmets, and the Valkyries have these wings on their helmets, and the Vikings have horns. So right away, no, they have actually found um, two other helmets that date from the Viking era, and they were skull caps. They're skull caps. They had protection to cover the eyes, but the mouth was open, the side of the face was open. It was a skull cap with some eye guards to help protect the head from impact.
So what you're telling me is it just looked good on Broadway, so why not?
Yeah, it looked good on Broadway, so why not? That's the big thing. That's the big one.
Yeah.
Um, Number two, the fact that all these guys were called Vikings. That is simply not true.
That's
So go ahead.
isn't it what they were doing?
Yeah, they go. I'm going to go to Viking. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're going Viking, and that means to go out and pillage and raid. But a lot of the people, and we'll get to this in a minute. A lot of people didn't come back, and there was a reason. There was a reason for that. So you get guys, boats that would come back, and you had whole other boats nobody ever saw again. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that in a minute. So obviously, the English referred to them as Northmen. They referred to them as pagans, Norsemen. Um, but pagan was the big one. So the
Yeah.
northern, the Europeans, the main Europeans thought they were all pagans. They were all evil. They were dirty, savage. It's because they were writing history at the time, and the
Mhm.
Vikings weren't. They would tell stories. So you'd sit down and basically you would hear history, and you would hear their religion verbally spoken, passed down generation to generation to generation, because that's the way they did it. So they
Yeah,
weren't
even
called.
today we don't have a lot of like written. We have the sagas, but that's about that's the main piece, isn't it? The sagas.
The sagas, that's right. And
Yeah.
originally those were all verbal.
Yeah.
So those were verbally passed down from generation to generation. Vikings were extremely violent. What do you think about that one?
Probably not.
They were violent, but it wouldn't be any other violent. It wouldn't be any more than anybody else was at the time.
Yeah.
According to Christian historical documents, these were heathens, and
Yeah.
they drank the blood of saints at the altar, and they trampled bodies in the temple of God, and they were a pestilence in the street.
So something like what the Romans did to the Carthaginians, or how I butchered that, but something like what Rome did to Carthage.
Yeah.
Yeah, smear
S-
campaign.
Smear campaign. These were people that did they raid? Yes, they did. Were they looking for ways to increase their number and get ahead? Yes, they were. But oftentimes there was a lot of them, and this is what we're going to get into in this and the next. There was a lot of times where a group of Vikings would go a Viking. They'd go a Viking. A lot of them would never come back. That's because they settled.
Yeah,
They would farm, they would trade, they'd sometimes return to their land of origin, but oftentimes they would stay there. This wasn't because they killed anybody and took their stuff. They just found land, they liked it, and they said, you know what, this is a lot easier to work than where I'm living now, so I'm going to stay here, and they'd
yeah,
settle. So, four, Vikings took what they wanted and sailed away, which we've pretty much been asking. We've been answering this question already. A lot of the times they traded. So we're talking all the way up into China. There were
yeah,
Viking traders in China. So they would learn languages. They would learn the ways of foreign traders, and then they trade with them and go back home, talk to people about them, tell them, hey, there's all these people up here in this part of the map that trade. A lot of us have never been there before. They teach the language, everything's spoken, so that's the way these people learned. One of the first and largest settlements was in Dublin, and
Dublin, Ireland.
that's right. And this was a huge city. It had a thriving port. It had a mint, and that mint is where the first Irish coins were ever made. And it wasn't just Dublin. York, Anglo-Saxon city, was relocated further towards the mouth of the river and settled by Vikings as a new and vibrant town. Jorvik, which was York. Iceland owes its settlements almost entirely to Vikings.
Yeah,
So, Normandy, there's so much that the Vikings explored, traded, settled, that it wasn't just about combat, and it
yeah,
wasn't
and I
just
mean
about raiding.
it's kind of disputed, but you could even make the argument Newfoundland, Canada.
Yes. Yes, and we're going to talk about that too. I don't know if we're going to get to that this time, but we're definitely going to talk about that. Did the Vikings settle in Canada and the States before anybody else? 5. Vikings were godless pagans.
Yeah, no.
Heathens, no. History is written by the victors, and guess
Yeah,
what? In this case, history is written by Christians.
yeah.
Nothing against you Christians out there. That's the way it
To be
was.
more precise, it's written by Catholic and Protestant.
Christian scribes that describes them as godless heathens with no intelligence, pure barbaric, evil demon men that wanted to pillage and burn churches.
Yeah,
So Viking religion was very structured, and it had established narratives. It was not a religion of book. Again, everything was done orally. So all the history, all the religion, all their mythology was spoken. They didn't practice their religion in temples. Like the Celts, they held places like groves and rivers sacred. So when you went into a beautiful grove or a river, you could sit and basically talk to your gods.
hmm,
So sometimes, very rarely, priests were involved, and they had ceremonies. And these priests were the heads of families, which is really interesting because in early Catholicism, very early, before the Dark Ages, before Vikings, a town wouldn't necessarily have a church, and a Bible, a Christian Bible, Catholic Bible, would be in pieces. So when you have like the book of Matthew, one family would have that book, and they would rotate where church was throughout their houses.
Mm,
So when you had church on a Sunday, you went to John Boy's house,
mhm.
and you had church there, and his family was responsible for feeding everybody and making sure there was room. And then you went over to Mary's house, and then when you went over to John's house, and then you went over to Chris's house or whatever. And that's how they did it. And each of them had a book and were responsible for teaching that book and keeping it safe.
Okay.
That changed in the Dark Ages
Yeah.
because the Catholic Church didn't like that. It wanted more control over.
Yeah, a little bit more control, a little bit more power, that hasn't changed. Um,
Did they perform sacrifices? Yes, they did. They did on animals and on people. But people having a sacrifice of a person was a rarity, and usually reserved for if there was some really bad shit happening. This was their ultimate sacrifice to their gods to say,
yeah.
"Hey, quit screwing around with us."
Yeah.
So,
So what does that just kind of side question? What does the Norse or Viking religion look like? Is it what a lot of people would think when you think Norse religion?
you've heard the term Midgard, right?
Yeah.
Midgard's Earth. That is where we are. Yggdrasil is the ultimate tree. It's everything. It's creation. So it stretches its roots from the earth that you walk on all the way to the gods. There were 6 realms, with a special place reserved for warriors on their death called Valhalla.
Yes.
The myth 6: Vikings were ignorant and illiterate barbarians.
Sounds familiar.
And guess who wrote that little ditty? They didn't write. They didn't write like Christians wrote. They verbally told their sagas. It wasn't until later, after the Viking Age had ended, that they started writing things down. But they had a very complex script of runes that was loaded with symbolism. Each letter in the Rook alphabet was also connected with a word. The
Okay.
F rune was called foe, which meant wealth or cattle. This makes sense within a barter society, as cattle hides were a way of measuring wealth. Runes could carry spiritual meaning too, and text records show how certain runes were connected with specific gods or goddesses. Runestones included lengthy dedications and personal names. Smaller inscriptions survive on personal items like combs and weapons. Like if you wanted to do Loki, the name Loki, you don't have to spell out Loki in
Mhm.
in Norse. All you have to do is have that L. That pretty much tells
Yeah.
everybody what's up that first rune. So far from the little bit barbarians, Vikings were some of the greatest naval engineers and travelers the world had ever seen.
Yeah.
They knew how to get from one point to another, hundreds and hundreds of years before some of the greatest naval vessels of the time would make trip, for instance, from Europe to the States, what would be one day called the United States, the Americas.
Yeah.
They were making that trip before anybody else would even dare attempt to make that trip. Prehistoric carvings and stone ships testify to the importance of boats within prehistoric Scandinavian society and religion. By the 9th century, they had developed advanced ships that could traverse the hostile northern Atlantic Ocean. They traveled further than any single race before the modern age and took huge risks whenever they set out on a voyage. They had to have enough food, they had to have enough water, and if anything good went wrong, that could have been the end of it.
Yeah.
One of the tales that we'll go into eventually in the future is how they got to Canada, and the fact
Ah,
that
yes.
that was a storm. That was a storm that blew them off course, and they thought it was they thought they had gone to Norway, and that's not where they went.
Ah,
So 7, Vikings treated their women extremely badly. Do you think that Vikings treated their women
probably
badly?
not. No.
So the Viking society itself was governed by jarls. I don't know if you've ever heard that before. Think of
Yeah.
like these were the guys that could one day become a king. So think about it like, well, this guy governs this land, and this guy governs this land, and this guy might govern this land, but all of them could possibly become king if they grab power, and that's what they wanted.
Yeah.
So you're looking at a large military society in which strength of arms was prized, yet smart men and women could also wield power. And women played a huge role in Viking society. They were guardians of the keys to both property and wealth, particularly when their menfolk were abroad. There's evidence that some were trained to be military leaders. Shield maidens, described throughout the mythology, women were held in high esteem and respect, with 2 buried within the famous Augsburg ship. One of the most venerated characters in the Germanic pantheon was Freya, goddess of sex, beauty, gold, and death. She rides a chariot pulled by 2 cats and is accompanied by the boar. And I'll do my very best to say this correctly. Hildisvini. Hildisbini. Uh, Women seem to have spiritual roles within the society, with wands discovered in many female graves. Furthermore, they had significantly better legal rights than their Christian counterparts and could divorce their husbands if they were violent or disrespectful towards them, which means all they had to do was slap that son of a bitch and say, "Nope, that's it. You're done. I've had it." And they were granted a divorce. What did he do to you? He hit me. That's it. Done. Take him out. We're going to give him 10 public lashings. You're officially divorced. Whereas Christian women couldn't do that. Their
No.
husbands beat the living shit out of them, and there wasn't anything they could do about it.
Well, also, I think motherhood was a major thing too when it comes to that. I could be wrong, but I think that was one of the reasons why they were held higher, because they could, if you're my thinking behind that is, if you're a combat uh organized people,
You need sons.
you need sons.
That's right.
So if you treat your women badly, well, then you don't get sons.
That's right. So here's another big one. This is the last one we'll go over today, and that is Vikings were unkept guys with long beards, and they were really dirty.
Mm,
Here's a big fu. Viking
yeah.
men and women were quite vain. They have found tweezers, combs, razors, and they went to great pains to make sure their appearance looked perfect. They didn't live in dark, dirty huts. They were in large, luxurious halls. They would have long, long wooden houses that were almost just like their boats where they lived. Absolutely magnificent buildings. There are still some fossilized halls like this that you can go in and you can see where they had their hearth fires. Beowulf is one of the poems, which was the setting for lavish feasts, gifts of gold, and display of skill at arms. These people partied. They were party animals. These are the jocks of
Yeah.
the 15 and 1600s. These are the jocks. They loved partying. They loved getting it on with beautiful women, and that's what they did. They weren't shaggy haired, ugly, broken nosed. They had to look good to get that Viking girl or that shield maiden, because they
Yeah.
didn't put up with shit. They wanted no weakness, and they wanted beautiful people.
Yeah.
So they had a really good diet too. A lot of fish, a lot of protein. So it was water and protein. Think about this real quick. How many times have you seen a boxer or a fighter go on like a water and fish diet and
Yeah.
bulk up? That's what these guys did.
Yeah.
When they weren't eating that, they were eating elk, bear, super high protein food, along with salmon and trout and fish. So these people were not ugly. They weren't unkept. You had to be top of your game to get the ladies. That was a reward for being the best at what you could do. Best at what
Yeah.
you can do, and you could have more than one wife. Didn't have to be just one wife. If your current wife agreed to it, you could have more than one wife. If she didn't, you could get amicably divorced and move on to the next one. It wasn't
Yeah.
always like a slap fest. So once they decided they wanted to get a divorce, they just got a divorce and boom, it was done. It was over. That was it. Moved on to your next whatever it was.
Yeah.
So, and that's your eight big Viking misconceptions, myths.
Well, that was, and I'm thinking of a good way to put this. And the other myth is that Valhalla died. No, it just went to 8 o'clock in the morning, Monday to Friday.
Yes, absolutely. That's a
All right,
freaking
and with that, folks, thank you, Loki, for joining us once again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I love doing these. I absolutely do.
All right, and here we go. Thank you all. Take her easy. Bye.